In this video, I'm going to explain why it is that saturated fat is anti-inflammatory and healthy. So where should we begin when we look at this topic, which is, and this is a very accurate statement in this slide that you're looking at right now. But let's go back to 2004, paper in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, which means it was reviewed by experts. You can see the title of the paper. So if saturated fatty acids were of no value or harmful to humans, evolution probably would not have established within the mammary gland the means to produce saturated fatty acids. Yeah, did you know that? That breast milk, what does it do? It ensures growth, development, survival of mammalian offspring. It's packed with saturated fatty acids. So if you read through here, I'll just read them off to you. So when you think about saturated fatty acids, and if you have saturated fatty acid fear, which a lot of people do because of the propaganda that you hear in the news and wherever else, unfortunately for medical doctors too. So here are some saturated fatty acids. So Butyric, Caproic, Caprylic, Capric, Lauric, Myristic, Palmitic, and Stearic. So if you've not heard of those fatty acids, well then why should you be automatically afraid of them if you never even heard of them before and all you've heard about before was the word saturated? So we're going deeper. So it turns out that, and you'll see once I get there in more detail, that these smaller guys, Caproic, Caprylic, Capric, Lauric in particular, are antiviral in nature, which is why they're so, and antibacterial, they're so useful in a baby's gut whose immune system is developing. And they're good for us too, as adults. So this is a table from my book, The Deflamed Diet. I've got about 60 pages and 4 or so chapters in this book about fats. So the topic today is saturated fatty acids, but to understand what they are, you got to understand what a mono is and a poly. So I'll show you a mono and poly a little bit later. And the polys, most of you listening, most likely have heard of omega-6, N6, N means omega, so omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids. So there are only 2 types of polyunsaturated fatty acids, omega-6, omega-3. I'll show you what they look like in a couple seconds. Monounsaturated fatty acids, a couple of those. The main one is called oleic acid. We got a whole bunch of saturated fatty acids, the ones that I just went over, and I'll show you their specific functions in a little while. But just consider this. Everyone has been told, watch your saturated watch your saturated fat intake. Eat olive oil instead. Well, you can see here olive oil has 15% of its fatty acids are saturated fatty acids. So it is impossible to eat any food and not get saturated fatty acids. You can see the amounts vary. So lard, beef tallow, you can see they're like 50-50 mono and saturated with a small amount of omega-6. And you can see butter, 66% saturated, which, by the way, is why butter retains its structure at room temperature, because saturated fatty acids don't melt at room temperature. The melting starts to begin more once you get into the, well, if you put a stick of butter at the windowsill in the summertime, it's 100 degrees, it'll melt. So in the human body, when you put butter in your mouth, it melts, never to solidify again, only to become incorporated into cell membranes, and I'll show you how that works in a little while. So here's coconut oil, which you've all heard is healthy, or you should have. 92% of the fatty acids in coconut oil saturated. The primary one, almost exclusively, but not exclusive, but the biggest one is called lauric acid, which is highly anti-inflammatory, antibacterial, antiviral. So it's fantastic saturated fatty acids. So I put these as healthy fats and oils. So lard, butter, beef tallow are fats, and olive oil, palm kernel, and coconut are obviously oils. So the difference between a fat and an oil, so a fat is solid at room temperature and an oil is liquid at room temperature. There you go, that's the difference. But they all contain saturated, mono, and polyunsaturated fatty acids. And by the way, if you want to choose the healthiest nut from a fatty acid perspective, you want to go with macadamia nuts. They have, basically macadamia nuts are almost kind of like a nut version of olive oil. You can see down below here has got virtually no polyunsaturated fatty acids. So it's very, very low in the nasty excess omega-6 that people tend to eat way too much of in the United States. So you kind of got the breakdown now. Fats and oils are made up of saturated, mono, and polyunsaturated fatty acids. And if this combination is liquid at room temperature, it's called an oil. If it's solid at room temperature, it's called a fat. That's it. Really simple and straightforward. Now, the issue for Americans is that our consumption pattern has changed massively over the years. So back in 1930, and by the way, this information comes from Dr. Mary Enig's excellent book called Know Your Fats. It's about 400 pages in this book. She is a lipid chemist. She's a lipid chemist and was one of the first to start criticizing the trans fats that emerged in, or really increased their volume as we went from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and onward. So in 1930, you can see, the average American consumed 124 grams of fat per day. 48 saturated, 40% mono, 12% polyunsaturated fatty acids. Move forward 55 years to 85, and all of a sudden we've got 40 more grams of fat in the average American diet. Well, where did it all come from? Well, 38% was saturated, 41% is mono, and 21% is the poly. So what does this mean? As a change as percentage, there was a 21% decrease in saturated fatty acid intake, and the biggie was a 75% increase in the polyunsaturated, and most of the polys and the extra MUFAs are going to be your trans fats. So they're your trans fats that are used for cooking bakery products that go on the shelf, and I'm talking the packaged goods. Not so much what's in the actual bakery, because you can use butter there as well. So you would have baked goods are going to have trans fats that are packaged, and you're going to have trans fats, and wherever you see partially hydrogenated fatty acids, and they're of course all over the place in packaged foods. So that's the big problem. We got an excess of omega-6 fatty acids and an excess of trans fats. That is the fat problem in America, not saturated fat. Further evidence that saturated fat is not a problem. So here's a paper, Inflammation, Atherosclerosis, Atherogenesis. This is published in the American Journal of Pathology. Let's look at the picture we are given, and you can see the accumulation of lipid. This is actually, see this outline right here I'm circling? That's an immune cell. It's called a foam cell. Before it's a foam cell, it's called a macrophage. But it transforms in the presence of oxidized LDL cholesterol, which is what you see right here. These yellow little bally things, you see right here. There you go. Oxidized LDL cholesterol being consumed by the macrophage that entered the blood vessel wall. You can see it squeezes through. So these are called endothelial cells, these guys are right here. And you can see these immune cells, they squeeze between the spaces of the endothelial cells. These guys separate, allows the immune cells to enter, and they start gobbling up oxidized LDL cholesterol. So first thing you need to notice is that if it's true that saturated fat builds up on top of the endothelial cells, that would be the image that we are given. But we know that's BS, and we've known for a long time that's complete BS. There is no buildup of cholesterol or fat on top of these endothelial. These are called endothelial cells. Doesn't work like that. The fat buildup occurs, as you can see, beneath the endothelial cells, and that is what causes this lumen, the blood vessel lumen, to become narrowed. It is the expanding atheroma. It's called fatty streak that becomes an atheroma, and the fat is actually not really fat. It is cholesterol that has been oxidized by hyperglycemic states for a long time, like metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, that causes the LDL cholesterol to become oxidized, and that's what gets engulfed. So you know that it's complete BS that saturated fatty acids build up on blood vessel wall, and saturated fatty acids do not direct these monocytes to enter into the endothelial cell and become macrophages that then become foam cells. That is not what saturated fatty acids do at all. So let's look at the structure of a saturated fatty acid. Really basic and simple. So here you can see what they look like, and the key spot to appreciate is right here. You can see this is called a double bond. Double bond. This is a single bond. So notice, we'll take a carbon right here. So this is called stearic acid, a saturated fatty acid. This is called oleic acid, a monounsaturated fatty acid. Oleic acid is the monounsaturated fatty acid that is touted, and it is healthy, found in olive oil, macadamia nuts, all your other nuts, wherever you see avocados would be another example. So really the big obvious ones would be macadamia, packed full of oleic, avocado, same thing, and olives. Okay, so this is oleic acid. You can see there's a bend. Why is there a bend? Well, notice again, at every carbon molecule, it has 4 bonds. 1, 2, 3, and 4. And so you can see here at carbon number 9 and 10, and here's carbon number 9 and 10. It's different looking because there's a double bond. Now notice the carbon that is right here, this carbon, has 2 bonds here, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So carbons always have 4 bonds. When there's a double bond, that means we get rid of the hydrogens, we add the bond here, and look what we have now, this big open space. And that is what allows these mono and polyunsaturated fatty acids to bend. They're more flexible. They give cells in the body fluidity. And these are also biologically active, unlike the saturated fats that are in cell membranes. Very, very different. So we need these saturated fatty acids and cholesterol to be in our cell membranes to give our cells structure. So to say we should avoid them is like preposterous at a shocking level. So I mentioned before about the double bonds. So let me show you the difference between real quick. Saturated omega 3s, 6s, and 9s. So here we go. So this is saturated. We just showed you before, stearic acid. There's 18 carbons, 0 double bonds. You can see straight line, no double bonds. Now I'm not showing the bends here because there could be a bend here, right? So notice here, linoleic acid's got 2 bonds, so it'll bend more than oleic. And then linolenic, alpha-linolenic, has 3 bonds. It'll bend more. And there are fatty acids that have up to 6 double bonds, really bendy. And those would be your fish oils. Your docosahexaenoic acid has 6 bonds, and EPA, eicosapentaenoic acid, has 5 bonds. So very, very bendy, a lot of fluidity. But cell membranes need structure. And so in order for cell membranes to have structure, you need saturated fatty acids. So this is a fatty acid, as are all of these. Put them all together, you got a fat or an oil, depending upon the concentration, as I showed you before. So fatty acids are these. Anytime you see COOH, that's an acid. So this is a fatty acid. Okay, so let's go a little further and look at structure. So here you can go right into Google or any other search place you want to look online and put in cell membrane phospholipid structure. So what we see right here is a single phospholipid. What we see here are multiple phospholipids, and it's called, you can see this how all cell membranes are. You got 2 layers, or you got two layers of phospholipids, and that's called the phospholipid bilayer. So you can see there's trillions of these things. Trillions, I mean, probably quadrillions in the human body. And you can see, once again, you can see how they look. You got this, it's called the polar head or the phosphatide head, and hanging down are fatty acids. So let's go jump over this way. So this is, imagine the circle right here, and then you got the fatty acids hanging down, circle right here, fatty acids hanging down. So this would be a monounsaturated fatty acid, and this would be a saturated fatty acid. Now this guy could be a poly and have a whole lot more bending going on. But for the most part, in general, the general rule is all phospholipids in all human cells, one of the fatty acids hanging down is saturated, which means we need quadrillions or hundreds of trillions of saturated fatty acids in the human body to be a normal human. Now, what else do we have in the cell membranes? Well, you can see right here, this is a protein. This is a carbohydrate going through the cell membrane. So you have protein, carbohydrate, and cholesterol. So it's the protein, carbohydrate, and cholesterol, and the saturated fats, fatty acids that give the structure to the cell membrane. So here is cholesterol. You can see. So just imagine with every one of these, so this is the phospholipid head, and every one of these that you see, one of the 2 is saturated. So you can see surrounding the cholesterol are saturated fatty acids. We'll put this one here. Saturated fatty acids to give structure to our cell membranes. So the idea that we should be terrified of cholesterol and saturated fatty acids is moronic. All of our cells need them for normal structure. The problem is, like anything else, if you get too much of them in your body. What would happen if you just ate like rabbits, for example, and that was your only meal? Well, you'd be very, very sick because there's no fat and minimal carbohydrate in rabbit meat. And so you would get rabbit meat disease. I forget what it's called, but it's horrific if you don't have enough fat or protein in the diet. And explorers discovered this when they started eating rabbits when they were down to nothing. So just eating protein is horrific. You've got to eat fat. It's just unbelievable. So here's a study. They looked at low-fat and low-carb diets, and they looked at circulating fatty acids and markers of inflammation. So here's what the diet looked like. First, these people were overweight, men and women, and they had atherogenic dyslipidemia. What does that mean? That means they've got high LDL cholesterol, and once you become atherogenic, you typically are hyperglycemic, and so this high LDL cholesterol tends to be more oxidized than it should be, and that's what causes atherosclerosis. Then you have low HDL. There will be high triglyceride levels. There will be high saturated fatty acids in circulation, and that is dyslipidemia. So remember, they gave a very low carbohydrate diet and a low fat diet. What's the difference? And you can see 1,500 calories each, basically. So in the low carb group, they were allowed to eat beef, poultry, fish, eggs, heavy cream, oils, moderate amounts of hard cheeses, low-carb vegetables, and salad dressings, and small amounts of nuts, nut butters, and seeds. All whole foods. Same thing over here. The foods that were encouraged to be eaten, same amount of calories, but encouraged to eat whole grains, so bread, cereals, pastas, lots of fruits, fruit juices, vegetables, vegetable oils, low-fat dairy, and lean meat. And that is what they ate in this group, and it was for 12 weeks. So if we believe the lie that we've been told, because these people had dyslipidemia, which means they had high triglycerides, low HDL, high circulating saturated fatty acids in circulation. If you believe the myth that eating high fat is going to create worse fats in circulation, you would be definitely wrong. So total saturated fatty acids measured in a blood test were consistently decreased following the high fat diet. So just eating fat does not screw you up. It is if you overeat, calorically speaking, fat will screw you up. And if you calorically overeat sugar, flour, it will screw you up. So we have to have proper caloric intake. So if we have too little fat in our diet, look what happens to us. This is back to that 2004 paper. Too little fat in the diet. Right? In the absence of sufficient dietary fat, the human body is capable of synthesizing the saturated fatty acids that it needs, that the body needs saturated fatty acids from carbohydrates. And these are the saturated fatty acids that you find in animal products. This shouldn't surprise you. If we go out to the field with the cows and just eat a whole bunch of corn, we're going to end up with the same fatty acid profile changes that the animal would have. So we want to be careful with our total carbohydrate intake. So the other thing that happens is that if we do eat too much sugar and flour and other carbohydrate sources, so if you eat donuts and Twinkies and lots of rice and potatoes and minimal amounts of anything else, and the calories are in excess, now we are going to store the excess calories from sugar and flour into fat cells. Now, when these fat cells swell up, what kind of fatty acids do they store from sugar and flour? They don't make monos, they don't make polys, they make saturated fats, saturated fatty acids. And they are stored in these swelling fat cells that are no longer able to go through the normal cell cycling. They become necrotic. When they become necrotic, they ooze out, they dump all their excessive saturated fatty acids that have been stored there in this high concentration that they're not supposed to be found in the human body. And what does it do when those saturated fatty acids are present? It causes immune cells to react to that blast of saturated fatty acids out of the fat cells as if they are releasing viral or bacterial components. And that is why you see this immune cell profile change that you would typically otherwise see only during a viral infection or cancer. And this is why it is so important to have a proper caloric intake and be physically active so that we have proper muscle function, which then has a profound effect on our endocrine system, maintain normal endocrine function. I'm talking in this context about avoiding diabetes. So this is the paper, the German paper. You can see it was published back in 2004. And you can see where they came from. They both were from the Department of Food Science and Technology at UC Davis, as well as you can see the latter was from the Nestle Research Center. Okay, so what do they talk about? They talk about these 8 saturated fatty acids. So now again, these are fatty acids, and if you combine them with other monos and polys, you will either get a liquid at room temperature called an oil, or a solid structure at room temperature called a fat. So let's look at these guys and how they function. First, let's look at that in the context of cholesterol, because that's what everyone freaks out about. So Caproic, Caprylic, Capric, and Stearic are neutral in terms of cholesterol. Now watch this. Lauric, Myristic, and Palmitic raise cholesterol. But look at this. They increase both LDL and HDL. And it's not massive, but they increase both HDL and LDL. Now think about the atherogenic lipid profile that most people have. They have way elevated LDL and they have way lowered HDL. That is not the function of saturated fats. That is not the function. The elevated LDL with the oxidation of LDL and the dropping off of HDL, which is highly pro-inflammatory, this combination, this is what you find in people who have high blood glucose levels. It is the metabolic syndrome, hyperglycemic diabetic states that causes HDL to go up and LDL to go down, and it has nothing to do with saturated fatty acids. So that's the first thing that you should know. Let's look at each individual one. So butyric acid, and they compared this to cow's milk and human milk. Okay, that's where they find them. And you can see butter and everything else. All right, so what is the function of butyric acid? It's an energy source for cells. Does not get stored in fat cells and generally anti-inflammatory. Boom. Caproic, Caprylic, Capric. Caproic, Caprylic, Capric. Yep, I got them all. So you got cow's milk. You can see the sources, human milk, goat's milk. What's the function? Antiviral, which is why they're so important to have in breast milk, which is why it's so important to have in your own diet, by the way. Lauric acid, which you find largely in coconut oil, but you do find, you can see, in cow's milk and human milk. Yeah, lauric acid. What does it do? Antiviral, antibacterial, and great for your teeth. Anti-plaquing, anti-dental caries. So look at what people have been made to be afraid of saturated fatty acids, and they're awesome. Myristic acid, you can see, cow's milk and human milk, most associated with cholesterol. But what do we have to remember? LDL would go up a little bit, and so would HDL. The opposite occurs in heart disease. LDL goes up, HDL goes way down, because that is caused by the metabolic syndrome, diabetes, high blood sugar states, the transformation that occurs because of the free radical pro-inflammatory state that occurs, and you get the shift in normal synthesis of LDL and HDL. So when you see that it is associated with cholesterol, remember it's equal elevation. And we always see for heart disease low HDL and the high LDL, which is oxidized. So the final two, palmitic acid, you see I kind of went through the butyric that has 2 carbons all the way up to 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14. Now we're on 16 carbon palmitic acid. What does it do? Lowers cholesterol in normolipidemic people compared with myristic and lauric acid, which in either way, for both of these, remember, equivalent raising of L and HDL. How about stearic acid? Does not raise cholesterol, seems to prevent heart disease. So why in the world have we been conditioned to believe that saturated fatty acids are so unhealthy? And the reason why is because they are viewed in the context of people who have heart disease and diabetes, and these people are almost always obese, and they have that change in saturated fat accumulation in the swelling obesity fat mass that I showed you previously. So this is a short bit of information, maybe it's like 20 minutes, I'm not really sure, that describes this. If you want to learn more about this, my suggestion would be to get Mary Enig's book, or get the Deflame diet, because this is the book that I spend 50 to 60 pages in going over saturated fatty acids, monounsaturated fatty acids, polyunsaturated fatty acids, and of course trans fatty acids. And so this is the detailed nutrition book where I describe all the different inflammatory reactions, at least that I'm aware of, for all this stuff. And then here I show what happens if you eat a pro-inflammatory diet, and there are more books coming along the way. If you've got a problem with weight, this is purely about the mental game that one must develop to maintain normal body weight throughout life. Single copies available at Amazon, and multiple volume copies, volume discounts. Multiple volume copies. Volume discounts are available if you click through to deflame.com, where all the social media stuff is that you can follow as well.